Good evening, everyone. It's 8:02, so we'll begin the webinar. Welcome to the Lee Kong Chian Natural History Museum's public webinar. And today it's about Singapore Birds Project. And today we have Kita and Movin. So I'll just give them a quick introduction so you guys can say hello, you can wave. Yeah, okay, so they have a virtual background, so I don't know if their hands are going to be missing. So Kita has been chasing feathered animals since 2014. He presently works as a research assistant in the Avian Evolution Lab in NUS, exploring various evolutionary questions. So he hopes to pique people's interest in birds and nature through the Singapore Birds Project. Movin is presently a PhD candidate in the Avian Evolution Lab in NUS, and he studies how biogeography influences regional bird diversity. So today, the both of them are going to share with us about this really cool project called the Singapore Birds Project. And before I hand the time over to them, I'll invite you guys to actually put in your questions for them in the chat box, and you can do so anytime during the talk. So we'll collate the questions and we'll answer as many as we can towards the end of the program. Okay, so without further ado, I'll hand the time over to Movin and Kita.
All right, thanks everyone. Thanks so much for coming, spending your Tuesday evening with us today. So my name is Movin and this is Kita, and basically we will be talking to you guys a bit about our group called the Singapore Birds Project. So let me just get started. So first of all, I'm sure everyone who's here knows what a bird is, but this is basically an excuse for me to show some really nice photos of Francis that we have on the right side. So basically a bird is a warm-blooded animal that means it regulates its own body temperature. It's a vertebrate, so it has a spine and is feathered, which basically means it has feathers. Everyone knows what feathers are. So anyway, on the right side of the screen, you can see like a whole bunch of birds of photos of birds that are taken in Singapore. So these are all like just an illustration of the wide types of body forms that birds have. So why are birds so cool? So of course, if our group is called the Singapore Birds Project, then we are focusing on birds for a reason. So why are they so great and amazing? Well, globally, they're highly diverse. There's over 10,000 species of birds, 10 to 11,000 species of birds, depending on whom you ask. And what I think is personally fascinating about them is that they were the first animals that I observed when I was growing up, the first animals that I noticed around me. And I think that's probably true for many people as well, especially in an urban area like Singapore. But more broadly, birds are very closely tied to environmental conditions. And because of the ability to fly, they are able to move from areas that are less conducive to areas that are more conducive, which means that oftentimes they can be used as an indication of habitat. And also because birds migrate and move around, right? They give us information across space and time because migration is something that happens annually and regularly. So people love birds for reasons beyond that as well, right? So I mean, birds conspicuous and loud, and they're fairly large and noticeable. So the amazing thing about Singapore is that because of the fact that we've greened up so many areas, we have many cool birds, like very attractive looking birds, like the oriole and the pigneck green pigeon in areas that are very close to residential areas, parks, and the ubiquitous Javan myna, which isn't even really native to Singapore, but you can see it being charming, or some say being like, I don't know, obtrusive and annoying in like a whole bunch of areas where you have food, like kopitiams and restaurants and open air restaurants. Again, they are the first animals that many people see. And in many cases, even for people who eventually move away from birds into other taxa, they are often the first animals that have piqued an interest in the natural world. So some of the things that are important to us in Singapore is that are things like migration. So what is migration? Migration is basically this annual movement from one area to another that birds undertake, that many bird species undertake. So in some cases, there are certain areas called flyways. So in the bottom right of the slide, you can see these big blocked areas that are sort of like encircled with these colored lines. And these are areas that are known as flyways. So flyways basically are areas that are known to be like a sort of a hotbed of migration. Birds migrate from both ends of the flyway, and they always take this path annually every year. So Singapore is smack dab right in the middle of this flyway known as the East Asian Australasian Flyway, which means that birds that want to go from their breeding grounds in Siberia or Russia, other parts of Russia, fly through the region to eventually get to places like Australia or eastern parts of Indonesia. Some even overwinter. That means they stay for the end of the year and the beginning of the year in Singapore as well. So the arrival timing of the birds and the numbers that arrive can actually indicate a lot, or tell us a lot about changes in both the breeding grounds up north and also about other stopover points. Because for instance, shorebirds, which are heavily reliant on these mud flats and other coastal areas, will be using areas along the coast of any of the countries that are between Russia and Singapore to stop and refuel. Having many fewer birds arrive in Singapore could be an indication like some of these feeding grounds are, not effective, they're not great anymore, they're not suitable for the birds anymore. So some of the birds have just, died on the way down because they starved to death. Or it could also mean that habitat in Singapore itself is no longer conducive for birds. So keeping track of things like these numbers and the timings of when these birds arrive can tell us a lot about, what's going on. Secondly, like for birds that live in Singapore all the time, there is also seasonality associated with their breeding seasons. And the great thing about birds is that most of them make it very obvious when they're about to breed. So birds call regularly, and calling often peaks just before breeding season when you're looking for mates or defending territories. And usually it is in line with, rainfall patterns. So things like the monsoons, or when usually there's a spike in insect availability, food availability for them to feed their youngs. So things like a spike in calling birds, displaying birds, or things like birds carrying nesting materials, documentation where there's like, oh, there's a pigeon carrying a branch or a weaver dragging like big pieces of grass, can also be indicative of like nest building. And so timing shifts where like, oh, now they're no longer getting nesting material at this time, or they're calling at a different time of the year when they did before, could indicate like, oh, there's a change in climate or there's a change in local conditions that is leading to this. And because of this ability for us to, because birds are so obvious about this, it's very easy for us as people to pick up on these things and be like, hey, something is off, something has changed, let's look into it a bit more deeply. So that is one reason why, like the Singapore Birds Project is so passionate about birds, because they tell us so much, not just about, birds and enjoying birds, but also about the environment that we have, our natural spaces in Singapore. And coupled with this is that there's also been a rise in interest in watching birds, the rise of the bird watchers, right? So one thing we found in recent years is that more and more people are interested in the natural world. And to me, it's kind of like a snowball effect, right? So something that starts off small, but eventually gathers momentum as it grows, right? So when you look at a bird, you're like, hey, that's a pretty bird. And then you find out a little bit more about it. And as people find out more about what they're looking at, their interest in it grows as well. And so there's a sort of like feedback loop between finding out more, being more interested, going out more, observing more birds. And because of the way like, like people are just more educated about natural world now, there is more like initial interest already. And because of that, the number of bird watchers has been rising really fast. And in tandem with that, cameras and binoculars and other forms of optical equipment that are kind of critical when it comes to watching birds have also become much cheaper and affordable. So now, not only is it possible to see birds really clearly with binoculars that most people can afford, but also cameras allow people to take photos of like these really attractive birds, document interesting behavior, nesting, displays, mating displays, nest parasitism, and things like that. So both of these together can explain like a whole bunch of like, and a sort of gradual, slow increase in bird watching, but we've really seen a spike in the last 2 years. And we suspect that COVID-19 may have played a role in this as well, mainly because people can no longer leave Singapore, or people could no longer easily leave Singapore to observe like or be in nature elsewhere. So they've taken to enjoying the parks and other natural spaces in Singapore. And one of the things that you can do in parks is actually, is birdwatch, right? And in line with that is the fact that small, seemingly insignificant birds have the sort of charismatic magnetism to draw huge crowds. So in the bottom right of the screen, there was a record of an Oriental Scops owl, which is a migrant to Singapore, that was in Jurong West, like just a residential estate last November, and it drew a huge crowd, just to see this small, arguably nondescript owl. And just this weekend, there was a record of the mangrove blue flycatcher from Pasir Ris Mangroves. So that's a resident bird, but not often found on the main island of Singapore. It's more often recorded in Pulau Tekong, and there are some records from Ubin as well. So this is and it also drew a huge crowd. So just the ability for birds to sort of like engender this kind of response from people is also really interesting for us. And this rise in bird watching has also resulted in a glut of data, actually. There are more eyes on the ground. And if you have more eyes on the ground, what happens is you're more likely to capture unusual events. Unusual events, by their very nature, are rare. They happen infrequently. So an example of this for birds would be vagrancy. So vagrancy is not migration. Migration implies a regular movement of birds through a certain space annually, semi-annually, things like that. Vagrancy happens very, very rarely. Vagrants are birds that don't regularly turn up in Singapore, but occasionally do, once in a while. And because Singapore is a relatively small island and we're relatively well surveyed by bird watchers, we have been picking up more and more vagrants, very rare birds that don't regularly come by, but have sort of like, due to strange meteorological like circumstances or other like climatic conditions, suddenly turned up in Singapore. So an example of that would be the birds on the right. So things like the fairy pitta, the tree pipit, and the Cinereus vulture were all picked up by keen bird watchers who were able to document and be like, hey, these things are slightly different from, the blue-winged pitta, or the paddy-field pipit, and the Himalayan griffins that often come by. And if not for this really dense coverage, we may have missed them. We would have missed out on these crucial bits of information on our avifauna. Another thing that's important is like, noting when birds come in during migration and when they leave. Because a lot of these more popular sites, places like Sungai Buloh Wetland Reserve, Chek Jawa, the Manai Mudflats, all super well covered. People are there every day. Whenever a rare or unusual bird turns up, we know the very day it does, because the day before people were there and they didn't see it. And we know when it leaves because people are searching for it weeks after and they don't find it. So because of this, there's a lot denser, more precise documentation of bird behavior and ecology in Singapore. And we have more data overall. And this data can in turn be used for things like management, informing policy, science as well. So this brings us back to the Singapore Birds Project, the thing that Keita and I are working on with a whole bunch of really excited, keen people. So we have three main goals. The first goal is to increase interest in bird watching in Singapore. Yeah, we do have a lot of people who are interested in bird watching already, but we could always have more. There's plenty of pie to go around. We always want more people to join us in our interests. The second thing is to build capacity within the bird watching community. So right now, people who come into bird watching, maybe they have, like, everyone is at different levels, right? Or different levels of how familiar they are with the bird. Some people are just beginners. So how do we build capacity to help people build skills like ID skills and other things like that, or build science literacy within the community so that we can communicate better? And the third of all is to make use of the data that's coming out from the bird watching community, and how can we use this data in a meaningful way and make sure that this data is compiled in a place and is accessible to everyone. So in terms of increasing interest in bird watching, the Singapore Birds Project has started with guided walks. We have our inaugural guided walk just this weekend, which was fully subscribed. A lot of interesting sightings, nesting, common Iora. And here we'd be keen to have like people of any skill level join us. So people who are just beginners, beginner bird watchers, not sure where to start, how to start, please come and join us. And even if you're more advanced and have like some really specific questions on bird watching or just like birds in Singapore or the region, please come on the walk as well. And we can definitely talk about these things. Secondly, like we said, building capacity in the bird watching community. IDing birds is a key skill when it comes to being a bird watcher, but birds don't always make it easy. So just the last season, we had two unusual flycatchers, the gray streaked flycatcher as well as the spotted flycatcher, which are both vagrants to Singapore, turn up. And many bird watchers in Singapore are unfamiliar with these birds because they turn up so rarely. And at Singapore Birds Project, we drafted an article called Identifying Little Brown Jobs of the genus Muscicapa in Singapore. So Muscicapa is the brown flycatcher genus, and there are 6 representatives that could be seen in Singapore. And we've sort of created an article to sort of explain how you can differentiate between the 6 of them. We also are keen on making science more accessible. So as part of the Birds Record, the Singapore Birds Project, the records committee that sort of determines the provenance of birds and the veracity of certain records, we have certain processes or thought processes that we follow when we are sort of determining these things. And we've sort of, and Genway helped draft an article on the ashy-headed green pigeon, which is the first occurrence in Singapore, and how the records committee sort of like what were the different trains of thought and the different arguments that the records committee sort of put forward to examine this sighting. Also, we have species profiles on our websites. So basically all birds in Singapore have a page, and key identification features and the ecology of the birds are all described. And so in this case, this is the Narcissus flycatcher. It's a rare bird. And so for rare birds, we also put previous accepted records of the bird on the page as well. Okay, so now for the next part of the presentation, I'm going to hand the time over to Keita and he will carry on. So Keita, all yours.
So as part of the work that we conduct in the Singapore Birds Project, we maintain the Singapore Birds checklist. Our checklist is revised twice a year, and this is so that we ensure that the latest taxonomy are reflected in the checklist. So there are quite a lot of birds that were thought to be the same, but recent works, especially genetic works, have discovered that some birds are actually different species. So these things are updated by a separate authority called IOC, and we make sure that our checklist is updated in accordance to that. So right now, there are about 420 species in our checklist. Over the past few years, we've had a lot of new bird watchers, and new birds have been added to the checklist. Just last year and this year, we've had 22 species added, and all of these records are placed in our Singapore Bird database. So over here, we make sure we compile all of the information that goes into our checklist, and we ensure that these things are transparently and easily available to people. So you might ask, why do we pay so much attention to records? Now, records, to some people, it might just be about chasing rare birds and so on, but actually they are very important in terms of conservation management and scientific understanding of the birds in Singapore. One of the things that I like to talk about is the shifting baseline syndrome. So, some of you might tell your kids or your grandkids, oh, a fishball noodle used to be 30 cents in the past, but now it's $3, $4. We can actually draw parallels to birds. The white-bellied woodpecker used to be resident in the past, but it's gone today. The curlew sandpiper used to be around in hundreds, but this year, now if you get one or two of them a year, they're considered lucky. And likewise, other things like the crested goshawk used to be rare in the past, now it's almost all over Singapore. And the Asian quail also used to be a migrant, but now it's screaming at your face every morning. So these things that we compile, they are very important primary evidence. And we want to ensure that these records are properly kept for future generations to look at. So I would like to talk a little bit about the history of record collections in Singapore. Prior to the 1800s, information might have been passed down by the locals through songs and folklore and all. But formal documentation started in 1819 after colonization. And these records were written in manuscripts, and these things, we can find them quite fortunately online, especially on the NUS library website. When reading through these old documents, some of the thoughts that run through my mind is, how do we know that the things they wrote were actually correct? What if they made mistakes? And one of the ways that we can verify this information is by looking at specimens. So in the museum, there are many different specimens that were collected from the past. Some of these birds, like the Blythe's hawk eagle and the black-thighed falconet, they were resident in the past, but they are gone today. And the records are all kept in terms of specimens so that we can verify that people were correct in the past. It's not just rare birds. Other things can be inferred from specimens too. So like the black-naped oriole. In the past, it was a migratory bird, and recent years, we've realized that these migratory birds that came to Singapore are actually a different species called the Chinese golden oriole. So the black-naped oriole that we see today are actually a combination of introduced and self-colonized birds that came around the 1920s and so on. The straw-headed bulbul as well. In the past, around the 1920s, they were found in Pulau Ubin, Pulau Tekong, but records on Singapore Island itself was only after 1950. So these sort of specimen records allow us to have a more confident understanding of the status in Singapore today. Now, after specimens stopped being collected as frequently, things started to change. So people did more field observations and mist netting. These sightings were all documented properly in words as well. Mist netting information was especially important because there are many birds that are actually quite difficult to identify in the field. So things like the dusky warbler and the besra, with examples on the right side. These birds were caught in mist nets and their measurements were all taken. And one example I'd like to give on how important these mist netting records were is when I talk about this cuckoo that I saw in Pulau Ubin about 6 years back. So when I found this bird at Pulau Ubin, I was very excited. I'm like, oh, it's a Himalayan cuckoo. It's a Himalayan cuckoo. I'm so glad I finally saw this bird. But When I went home and I read up more about it, I realized that the Himalayan cuckoo and the Oriental cuckoo, they are these two very similar looking birds that cannot be told apart reliably by sight alone. And then as I read up more, I realized that there are actually only two proper records of the Himalayan cuckoo in Singapore. So on the left is a Himalayan cuckoo, and on the right of the picture is an Oriental cuckoo. As you can see here, their sizes are quite different, but their plumage, although here it looks different because of variability, they're actually almost impossible to tell apart in the field. And in 1995, two birds were caught by Peter Kennelly. He took measurements of these birds, and back then, although they were both thought to be Oriental cuckoos, the same species, now we know that they are different species of birds, and from these ringing records, we can tell that there are actually only two formal documentation of the Himalayan cuckoo in Singapore. So in more recent years, the locals have started spearheading record collection in Singapore. There were several groups, such as the Bird Ecology Study Group, that was led by the late conservation giant Subra Charjaturai, as well as Dr. Y.C. Wee. They collaborate with the Lee Kong Chian Museum, as well as other members from the Nature Society of Singapore Bird Group. And in 2007, the latest checklist, annotated checklist for the birds of Singapore, was published by Wang Luan-King and Christopher Hales. Today, we live in a very different era. You know, there's Facebook, there's eBird, WhatsApp, Telegram, TikTok, Instagram. There's plenty of other things. Records are all over the place. We probably have about 3,000 active bird watchers, and people are sharing things, you know, left, right, center. Sometimes they get lost, sometimes they get deleted. It's very difficult to find out information about things. And, you know, when we think back about the history of ornithology in Singapore, it's almost 200 years. There's so much information. Yet there wasn't a place where this information was centralized until we decided to create our database. And now I'm going to give a very quick demonstration of how our database works. Here it is. So in our database, the species that we focus on are birds that are rare in Singapore. Those birds can be found in the rarities list. That's loading, and it's taking a while. But these are birds that are essentially difficult to find in Singapore. They used to be resident, or they are vagrants or rare migrants that come maybe once or twice a year. And some of the records are still in progress, but most of them have been compiled. And for bird watchers, we want to make this very easy to use. So let's say you're going somewhere this weekend and you want to look for a broadbill. All you need to do is search broadbill, and all the records of the broadbills would show up. Let's say I want to find a green broadbill. Here I can find all the information of the green broadbills that were ever seen in Singapore. And when you click each individual record, say this is a record from myself. Oh dear. This was my record from 2014 that's refusing to load. There we go. This was from Christmas 2014 because everyone spends Christmas on Pulau Ubin, right? I found a green broadbill over there. I didn't know what it was back then, but in 2015, after I got Facebook, I decided to post it and people confirmed my sighting. So what we do in our database is that we ensure we include all of the relevant links to the different sites where information on this sighting can be found, as well as the primary evidence if available. For some other records, we might not have the media file for them because they might not have been submitted to us, but we put in effort to compile these data from other sources. So let's say we look at this black and red broadbill. This was actually misnetted by the MParks team. And although the media file is not here, what we do is to put a link to the primary documentation that the MParks team published. So here we have black and red broadbill that was documented by them. We can also look at other records. So let's say we take a look at the ashy-headed green pigeon that Movin shared earlier on. There's only one record from Singapore, but it was actually a pretty contentious one. Some people were wondering, you know, is this wild? Is this an escapee? And in our records committee, although we came to a conclusion, we didn't want to just tell people, okay, we accept it. That's the end of the story. What we wanted to do was to make sure that people can get can understand the reason why we made certain decisions. So in many of our records, we put the background and the decisions that we made, the discussions that we had, so that members of the community and even researchers can come to their own conclusion on what they think about certain records. So as you can see, a lot of these records keeping, it's very heavily reliant on the community. We have a team of about 17 people now, but we can't clone ourselves and run all over the island to look for birds, right? And we really need all of you to help to submit your records. And it's very easy to do as well. If you go to the record submission page, some of these things are pretty straightforward. Your name, email address, and the species. But some of the things that we like to pay attention to are things like the supporting information, the description of the bird that you saw. What was it doing? How did it look like? Was it big? Was it small? Was it yellow, red? And if you have photos and sound recordings, we would really encourage you to share them with us so that people can take a look and come to a conclusion themselves on whether they agree on the identification of certain species. So that's about it for our live demonstration. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask us. And that pretty much wraps up our talk. Actually, in the Singapore Birds Project, we really want to get people interested in the birds. We want to make sure we have resources that are easy to use and transparent. We really hope to teach people about the avifauna in Singapore, about conservation issues, and really, just have fun, go out there doing bird watching. And this hobby that you undertake is actually very important in terms of science and conservation as well, because the birds that you observe in the wild, if you submit these data to appropriate sources such as eBird or maybe us, they can be used to inform scientific conservation decisions and allow the birds in the region to be more better understood. So yeah, that's pretty much it. We hope that we have provided a rough understanding of what the Singapore Birds Project does. And we are really thankful to the following people: Angus Lamont, thanks for sharing all of your old documents with us; Morton and Bishu Strange, as well as Shamla Subaraj for all of the support; Kelvin from the museum for allowing us access; Frank Ryan and our lab members for all of the support and the constructive feedback; our Singapore Birds Project teammates, of course, Raghav and Francis, especially for maintaining our database; Jar, and all of you who helped organize this talk, as well as everyone who has attended today. Thank you very much. We can be found on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and our website. Please follow us, like and subscribe. and
comment.
Yep, we're happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Kita and Movin. So we can have about 15 minutes of question and answer. So if there's anyone who would like to unmute yourselves, okay, maybe at this point, for those who can, it will be great if you can switch on your video so that our speakers have faces to talk to, since all of us have our video switched off. So yeah, so if you have any questions, you can unmute yourself and ask them directly. Anyone? You can just unmute yourselves. Or maybe Movin, Kita, do you guys want to start with the questions in the chat box? There are 2 questions over there.
Okay, we will address the first question.
Shall we read it first and then maybe we'll answer it afterwards?
Yeah, okay. So so Chow and Tong asked, we have various bird record checklists in Singapore. So how do we know that which checklist is more current or accurate?
Okay, so there are several checklists. There's the Nature Society checklist, our checklist, and various other independent bird watchers. The most recent published one was by Wang Langking and Christopher Hills in 2007. So different checklists have different philosophies, I suppose. And, we aren't here to say who's right or who's wrong, because sometimes people have different thoughts about scientific processes, right? And with regards to this, I think part of it is dependent on what you want to use the checklist for. So if you are, let's say you want to use it mainly for keeping a track of what birds you have seen, the discrepancy might not be as much. But let's say it's for some conservation actions and things like that. What I would advise is to look at how frequently it's updated, how transparent these organizations are. And, for us, we do make an effort to ensure that all of our reasons are properly spelled out. We explain to people why we make the certain decisions we do, even though there might be contentious issues. So, I mean, I would like to answer that we are more current and accurate, but it's really up to you to make a decision on that.
Okay. All right. So Jared asked, is there a way to download the full database?
Right now, we don't have a way to do that. So we are still in the process of compiling all of the records, and downloading is not an option for now, but you can let us know and we can find ways to go around that if there are collaborations and projects that you are interested in.
Okay.
We have
So,
a direct message to us regarding
okay.
how guided walks can be joined. So we only have had one that was last weekend. We are planning to have more, and we would promote it on our socials. So we will have links for the guided walks once they are being organized.
Okay. So Dylan asks, how are borders of migration flyways defined?
Oh, okay. Thank you for that question. So basically, the idea between flyways are to sort of give us this sort of generalizable idea of like where are most birds from this area going to, right? So the two things that we need to know about flyways are where the birds breeding and where they're wintering. So based on based on just patterns, it's very clear that the vast majority of birds follow very specific pathways, So this, how the borders are determined is really based on, records of that's why record keeping is important, like records of birds and, where they turn up and when they turn up in those areas. So for instance, if I know that, like, say, the black-tailed godwit, right? It's always flying from Russia and it's always ending up in Australia, or like the most of the population ends up in Australia. But there are also populations that winter in the eastern parts of of Indonesia and other places like that. Then I would basically draw a huge blob around the godwit's range, right? So it would encompass all of those areas for all of those records. And then when I do that for more and more species, eventually I get these generalizable areas, right? Like, so where most species winter or travel would be in these flyways. Of course, you're going to get birds that maybe don't utilize the entire flyway. For instance, like I think Lisa's flycatcher, also called the greenback flycatcher, that's a bird that's from somewhere in China. It winters in here, Singapore. So parts of the Malay Peninsula in Singapore. So they're not utilizing the whole flyway. They're not traveling from Russia to Australia, but they utilize a portion of that flyway. And the flyways depicted usually show the most extreme motions, right? Like birds that are going from Russia to Australia, that's the fullest extent. You can't fly more than that, right? So the flyways are bounded by those, but even within the flyways itself, we know of many sort of like smaller movements as well. So taking all of these into account sort of helps shape the idea of like, a flyway being like a legit thing. Yeah.
It's really cool. Okay, does anyone want to unmute yourselves to ask any questions?
We'd love to hear you guys. Come on.
Yes. Anyone? Can I see one person unmuting themselves?
I'm a visitor to Singapore, so I have come for a short visit. Which is the best location for bird watching, and at what time of the day for bird watching?
What's a good place to watch
good place
and what time? Thank you for the question. Yeah.
Typically for bird watching, you would like to go out early in the morning, maybe until around 9-10 when it gets too hot. That's when birds are most active. They're most vocal as well. They'll be singing all over the place, as well as in the evening. So maybe like 5+, they will start getting active also. So the best place for bird watching, my personal favorite would be the central catchment. That's where a lot of the forested birds in Singapore are still around. When you walk Rifle Range in the morning, you can hear, the short-tailed babblers, the chestnut-winged babblers. And when you go to Jelutong Tower, you can have a pretty nice open view of the forest in central catchment. But there are also other places like Sungai Buloh, Kranji Marshes. There you get a very different suite of birds. In the Sungai Buloh, you get the migratory shorebirds, Pacific golden plovers, and whimbrels sometimes. If you go to Kranji Marshes, you can see a lot of marshland birds. So these are some of the recommended locations I would give. You can also take a look at records on eBird. So eBird.com allows you to look at different hotspots in Singapore, and you can look for specific species that you might want to target and go to that place, typically early in the morning or later in the evening.
Thank you.
Sure.
Kaden has a very interesting question. Kaden, would you like to unmute yourself to read out your question?
Very old records confirmed. I remember seeing a dull-billed tern record with little description, with the only description being it was flying with 2 white-winged terns.
This is a very good question, actually, and Dylan and I, who compiled a lot of these old records, had a very tough time coming to a conclusion on many of these old records. So the thing with many of these old records are that many of them can no longer be verifiable. The primary documentation is in many instances lost, and what we can only do is to infer. So for some of these birds, say gaubild tern, what we know is that they used to be quite common in the past, although they are very rare today. This is in line with what I talked earlier on about the shifting baseline syndrome. Some birds, gaubild tern, other things like garganines, a lot of the shorebirds, they used to be way more common in the past than they are today. And we can have a rough, confidence that people in the past were more familiar with these birds. The same way we are quite familiar with Pacific golden plovers today, for example. We don't know what's going to happen 30, 50 years from now. One day, Pacific golden plovers might end up being very rare birds. But when that day, hopefully it doesn't come, but if it does come, the people 50 years from now will be wondering, then how did the people in the past know that they were looking at Pacific golden plovers, right? But the thing is that today when we see Pacific golden plovers, we don't really pay attention to, I think, every single description. So what Dylan and I did was to apply this philosophy to where we stand today. The birds in the past, if they are not too unbelievable, we decided to make a decision and just accept them the way it was. But there are other records, for example, the Eurasian woodcock. There are two records, one was from Seletar, one was from Changi. This species is way more unexpected in Singapore because they typically winter, even in Malaysia, they're only in montane areas. So for some of these old records, we decided, even though there's no description, we are not going to trust it and we'll throw them away. Yeah, very good question.
Okay, so there's one question about SKPs. Caleb, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? Is Caleb there? Oh, okay. So let me read out the question. Okay, so Caleb asked, did you guys accept all the records, including the SKP ones, and how do you separate them? Let's say the ashy-headed green pigeon. How do you guys know that it's not an SKP species?
Oh, okay. So thanks so much for that. So, hi, Caleb. So, we don't accept all records. So if it's clearly an SKP, we will not include it into the checklist. The other question here, which I think is also very interesting, is like, how do we come to a conclusion about whether a bird that is unusual, like a vagrant, is it actually here naturally, or is it like an escapee? So, I mean, as Keita said, like if you go to the records, right, you will also be able to see a rationale behind it. But for ashy-headed green pigeon, let me just like sort of outline it very quickly. So when you see a bird that comes into Singapore and it's unusual, there are a few things we want to consider. Where is it naturally from? Is it very nearby or is it very far away? Is it known to migrate or is it known to be sedentary? Does it not move very much within its range? Is it known from the agricultural trade? That means, is it traded widely? Then also, is it easily seen? Like, are people going to be able to easily identify the bird if they see it, before? So if a bird is known to migrate, but maybe migrates nearby to Singapore, but hasn't been recorded from here before, for instance, and it turns up in Singapore, it's highly likely that it is natural, like this movement is natural. It might be just an individual making its way here. Another point, if it's not common in the trade, then we know, hey, it's unlikely they came through captive means. It's more likely to be of wild provenance. If a bird is easily identifiable, if a bird is tricky to identify, in the case of some of the pipits, like Blight's pipit or Richard's pipit, then it could easily have slipped past the whole of the Malay Peninsula and come to Singapore as well. So these are all things that we take into account when we determine the provenance of the ashy-headed green pigeon, for instance. So in the case of the ashy-headed green pigeon, where is it from? Most of the records are from north of the Isthmus of Kra, so mainly from Thailand. This is an Indo-Chinese monsoon species. So by and large, you would expect, hey, these are monsoon land species from the dry forest of Thailand not to really move that much. It's not a known migrant. But on the flip side, the green pigeons are fruit-eating birds, and fruit-eating birds are known to travel long distances. So, that's a plus point for it actually moving across a long distance. Third of all, this is a bird that from a distance would look very similar to a thick-billed green pigeon, which is native to Malaysia and Singapore. If the bird or a few birds came true, people might easily just dismiss it as thick-billed green pigeon, right? So that's another plus point for why it might actually be a wild bird. The other thing on top of that is the fact that, is this bird known from captivity in Singapore? So green pigeons, they are traded in aviculture, but not so much on a level that's easy for non-specialist buyers to get. So if I'm a regular bird keeper, it's not easy for me to get a green pigeon. I'll have to order one. They're very widely traded in terms of zoological institutions, but not so much on day-to-day. We know, or we were told by the bird park that, hey, we don't have this species in our collection. So in that case, it became more of a case of like, hey, there's no one locally who's keeping this bird. It could have easily been overlooked. Some movements of ashy-headed green pigeon into northern peninsula, the northern parts of the Malay Peninsula may have also been overlooked because it might have looked like a thick-billed green pigeon. And combining all of this evidence together, I think the consensus of the committee was that, hey, it's probably a wild bird. But also, there is a reason why we have a whole committee of people doing it. We tap on group expertise, right? So we tap on many people's like thoughts before we come to a conclusion on any birds. So because of that, that also adds to a certain sense of like robustness in terms of like how we come to any conclusions. Yep.
That was a very, very good elaborate explanation. Okay, Clarice has a question, sorry. So does the Singapore Bird Project have plans to be engaged in conservation planning in Singapore?
Clarice, thanks for the question. Thanks for coming also. Appreciate the support. I think that is a bit of a complicated question because we are SBP, we are the Singapore Birds Project, but at the same time, we are also individuals who are engaged in conservation work individually. So sometimes it becomes a bit like, yeah, so we as individuals and members of the Singapore Birds Project are working on certain conservation planning things in Singapore, but the organization as a whole isn't officially involved in that sense. That might change in the future depending on how things go. But I mean, like right now, it's at a comfortable level. Like a bunch of us are involved in conservation planning or management or suggestions as well. So.
Okay, so Pavarni has a question. How are local birds affected by warming and habitat loss in Singapore?
For global warming, I think the main group of birds that will be affected are the shorebirds. So, you know, as sea level rises, the amount of shoreline decreases, and this diminishes the amount of habitat that they have. When we talk about global warming, usually a lot of the birds that are affected are temperate birds or montane birds, because, you know, their habitat gets warmer and they have to go higher and higher up the mountain to breed. Eventually, some of them might be gone. For Singapore, in terms of that, there isn't as much impact. But if you go further north to Malaysia, some of the birds, you know, say Fraser's Hue, birds like the bullfinch has disappeared, not disappeared, but they're getting a lot rarer now. I guess not so much locally in terms of
not in
birds.
Singapore.
And habitat loss, it's a huge issue for Singapore and globally as well. You know, when you lose forested habitat, of course, a lot of the birds that require those places would disappear. A lot of the impacts have already been made, so to speak. The birds that are in the central catchment today are sort of like survivors of habitat loss. But at the same time, a lot of habitat is also being artificially created, thankfully. So places like wetlands and you know, other scrubby habitat has allowed different groups of birds that require a different kind of habitat to survive. So yeah, habitat loss is sort of like a you know, I think how do I phrase this?
It's tricky. So maybe the thing that we can think of is not just habitat loss, but also habitat, I'm sorry, I keep phasing in and out of existence, but yeah, the thing is, it's not just about habitat loss, but it's also about habitat quality. Sometimes just having the habitat, but missing certain attributes of the habitat that aren't so obvious to us, but are important to birds for breeding or whatever, might also be a problem. So there's still a lot that we have yet to understand about bird ecology. So for instance, why do we have so few freshwater birds compared to like comparable, like arguably poorer quality wetlands overseas, like in Malaysia. We were in Sri Lanka recently. We saw like small patches of wetland with huge numbers of breeding, like swampland and things like that. Why Kranji marshes look so nice, no swampland there, right? Like so much fewer swamplands there. So like, I mean, these are all questions that are complicated and we need to do more research on. The other thing I would like to just add is that there's this concept called extinction debt. So it means like when you lose the habitat or when something happens, there is extinction that happens, but there's also extinction that you owe in a sense. So extinction debt, that means that like some things that are around now are still on their way out if we don't do something right now to resuscitate or like rehabilitate some of the habitats. So birds off the top of my head, things like the babblers, I think they're short-tailed babbler and chestnut-winged babbler, things that we see like clear declines in populations, but the habitat is still there, but is the quality good enough to sustain a population long-term? We're not sure. So this question maybe it seems simple and maybe you were expecting a more straightforward answer, but unfortunately it is quite complicated. And there are no easy answers. A lot of it is very nuanced and I mean, it just is that way. And it's just like, you know, like for every single issue, we need to think about it in a very clear sort of like measured way. Yeah.
Oh, that answers the question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So let's answer Nazri's question. So where do you draw the line between escapee birds and species that have established themselves over the years? Is it only through a confirmed breeding record?
So right now, the metric we use is to look at breeding records. Some birds, there are a lot of escapees of them. I think a good example would be the cockatoos. So sulfur-crested cockatoo, they have been seen for quite a long time, maybe 30 years and so on. But there aren't a lot of confirmed breeding records. And this means that the birds that are around in Singapore are not having a self-sustaining population. So these are records that we attribute to escapees. And usually when we say that something has established themselves, we want to ensure that there are several self-sustaining, not ensure that there are several, but we would classify them as established species if there are several breeding populations. So examples would include the monk parakeet, you know, their colonies you can see in Pasir Ris. They have been expanding now, they are around Ulu Pandan as well. Golden-backed weavers, lorong halos, Kranji marshes, they're all over the place, replacing Bayer weavers. It's really worrying. Other things like masked lapwing as well. So yeah, I think what you mentioned is correct. Confirmed breeding record is one of the very key features that we look at. But you know, sometimes some birds are very difficult to find breeding. A good example would be the waxbills. So these birds like to build their nests inside those tall reeds that are very hard to survey. But what we know from Singapore is that there are a lot of juvenile birds that are being fed by adults. And for those birds, even though we can't say that there was a nest, it's quite obvious they are breeding. You know, they don't pop out of existence from nowhere. So those are some proxies that we use as well.
So so I see a couple of questions on introductions, escapee, and invasive. So I'm going to go through them really quickly. So birds that escape are considered introduced. If they establish a population, that means they have a breeding population, then they're established. The difference between invasive and introduced is quite a technical one, in the sense that in order for a species to be considered invasive, you must be able to show that it negatively impacts the population or like a success of a native species. So there are many species, in fact, most species that are introduced do not actually go on to be invasive. Most species just do their own thing, or they mainly are commensals, only, you know, like active in cities or urban areas. But there's a few species, and the reason that we are so uptight about invasive species is because those few species can do a lot of damage, right? So birds or any animal that sort of establishes and negatively impacts native species, they tend to do that in a very, very, very bad way. And that's the difference, basically. If you can prove that there is negative impact on native species, it's invasive. If not, it's just an alien species or it's an introduced species. Yep. The problem is, in order to be proven to be an invasive species, you need to do a study. In many cases, we see and we know there's an impact. The impact is negative, but because there's no like bespoke work to sort of prove like, hey, the impact is negative, and I've proven it by doing analysis ABC or by doing observations over a period of X time, right? It's difficult. So I think off the top of my head, golden-back weaver right? We see more of them, we see less Bioweaver.
Monk parakeet.
Monk parakeets, yeah. So things like that, we suspect really strongly suspect that they might be invasive, but without the studies, we cannot put the invasive label on them officially. Yeah.
Okay, so I hope that clarifies those three terms. Okay, does anyone else have any questions? Feel free to unmute yourselves or type it in the chat box. We were just at 30 seconds. So yeah, you only have your head there.
Okay. Oh.
Okay, so before everyone logs off, maybe let's quickly share my screen again, because we'll be really grateful to get you guys to help us fill in a feedback form about this webinar. So please scan the QR code, or you can click on the URL that my colleague has put in the chat box, and yeah, just spend a minute or two to help us fill in the feedback form. Okay, so while you guys are doing that, feel free to ask any more questions if you'd like to. If not, thank you very much, and I hope you guys have a very good evening. But we'll still be here, so yeah, as you guys stream out, you can still ask questions if you're shy and you want to wait for the numbers to dwindle. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much for coming, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Really
for spending
appreciate
the
it. Yeah.
evening here.
Oh, we have a question. We have two questions. Okay, so Ting Yi asks, you guys want to read it out?
Okay, so with bird feeders being incorporated with technology, how will such feeders help with data collection of birds? And would such a feeder be effective in data collection for birds in Singapore? Well, first of all, don't do that because it's illegal. Feeding birds in Singapore is illegal. It's a complicated question, right? Because
elsewhere in, say, Britain or America, bird feeders are quite a common thing. And it is almost like a citizen science project. You know, people have feeders in their backyard and birds come and they take photos, they take observations. These have been very, very effective data collection methods. But it's a little bit tricky in Singapore because we cannot feed the birds. It's illegal.
yeah, so no feeding birds in Singapore. Don't do it. It's illegal, and parks will catch. I mean, police will catch. But like,
it will be effective, definitely, but we can't do that.
Yeah. And also because I think in Singapore, we have a high number of fairly large, fairly obtrusive birds like myna and pigeons that can also spread diseases, right? So like, I mean, because of that concern, it's also probably a good idea that we're not allowed to feed birds. How do we manage pet birds? Has it been an issue?
Oh, it has been an issue in that birds escape. How do we manage pet birds? I presume it's from a keeping perspective, or is it from an escapee perspective? From a keeping perspective, I mean, do your best not to get them escaped.
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking more broadly about importing stuff, then it's really an issue regarding demand and supply. So if there's demand for certain things, they're going to come in, right? And the thing about it is that a lot of these other trade, so a lot of the problem is that a lot of trade related things are concerning endangered species, right? So CITES Appendix 1, 2, 3. Most of the birds we're getting are not threatened. The ones that are escaping and becoming established are not threatened birds. So they're not technically illegal. It's just that there is sort of a demand for them, especially during like Vesak Day and times like that when people do mercy releases and things like that. So before that, there's actually a demand, and a bunch of like small birds that can be easily released, like munias and finches and stuff like that, do come in. So, I mean, again, it's one of those things where you have cultural practices coming in like sort of butting heads with like sort of like these like best practices in terms of like ecology as well. But I mean, we just have to manage it the best we can. There's no easy answer to it. There are always going to be people who feel like, you know, I'm doing the right thing by freeing the birds. And it's a question of education. And it's a question of like improving scientific literacy amongst not just like, you know, students now, but also across all generations, I think.
I think Tamarani has a sub question. Like she mentioned foot rings. Like foot rings for the birds.
Okay, so foot rings in birds are good. So basically, for threatened, like so things like parrots, which are often bred in captivity, they will they'll slip the ring, a closed ring on the bird's foot, like when it's young, right? And then as it grows up, the ring can no longer go over the foot because the foot is too big, but it's still like comfortable for the bird. So that is possible for birds that are bred in captivity. Many birds are wild caught. That is just an unavoidable fact. And sadly, we are just not in, like, so a lot of the finches and things like that, those are all wild caught birds, right? They're going to come from the wild. So because of that, they're not going to have rings. And it's going to be very difficult to enforce that every bird comes in with a ring because captive bred birds are more expensive. Not everyone wants to spend a lot of money on birds. And in some cases, people are just buying birds to release the bird, right? Like, so for mercy releases and things like that. So then people just want to release as many birds as they can for as little money. So it's difficult. Ideally, yes, foot rings should be there. And definitely for birds that are, threatened on the CITES list, you should have foot rings, right? Just to prove that these birds were born in captivity and not taken from the wild. But like, there are many categories of birds in Singapore that are kept in the pet trade, and this sort of like foot ring thing works for one category, the threatened birds, but not really well for birds that are easily caught in from the wild and plentiful.
Okay. All right, I think maybe we have time for one more question. Okay, I think these two are pretty related. So is playing a call for the bird considered illegal in bird terms?
In bird terms,
Yes,
Like, is playing a bird call to identify the bird, like, is it considered
playback.
illegal?
okay. Is it illegal in Singapore? I think it probably is illegal in Singapore.
Yeah.
Doing it in nature reserves and parks.
Yeah. I'm not sure. Yeah, we wouldn't say that we're 100% sure about the legal ramifications of that in Singapore, but we would recommend against using playback in areas that are in parks land, right? So like in areas that are officially protected and gazetted, please don't play back there.
Yeah, I'm not too sure if it's illegal, but I think there are ethical issues with using
There are ethical
playbacks.
issues with it.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah,
think
so
that
yeah.
connects quite well with Jeff's question.
Yeah, correct. Just question. So does establishing a common code of ethics across all bird watchers and bird photographers possible? Do you think it's possible?
We really do hope that it is. I think we do have to admit that there are always going to be black sheeps around. Even if you have a crowd and 99% of the people are behaving, all you need is one person to decide to chase after the bird in question, and it kind of ruins the day for everyone. I actually do kind of think that in most situations in Singapore, the community kind of self-polices. When people are there, they'll tell each other, hey, don't go so close, hey, let's all just wait here together. So there is this unwritten rule that most people follow. It would be nice to create a common code of ethics, and in fact there already are by several different groups. The NPSS, Nature Photography Society of Singapore, NSS also has their one. I think NParks would probably have some guidelines on how to deal with wildlife as well. And they are actually all quite similar. Don't disturb the bird, the animal's welfare comes. How much they are followed and enforced is the main contention here.
Yeah, but I think it's tough. So that's why like outreach is important, right? Like education.
Yeah, exactly. Education and exposure
and communication. We have a lot of new people in our community today, and some people really don't know that they shouldn't be doing some things. They don't know how far it is to be from a bird. It might also be a little bit difficult to understand the bird's behavior. So generally, when a bird is threatened, they tend to behave in a certain way when compared to when they're comfortable. So these are things that you can also tell people in the field when you meet them. If they're going too close, you just say, hey, excuse me, I think the bird is a bit threatened. Let's all just wait here.
Yeah, I think being kind and patient with people helps. I think people are just more willing to listen if you are being patient, right? If you're being nice about it, then people are like, oh yeah, okay, I don't want to inconvenience you because you're so nice. So I mean, so things like that,
Yeah, I guess it happens with every group of animals also, not just birds. Yeah. Okay, it's 9:01, so I think we have to close shop now. Okay, so I think thank you very much, everyone, for joining us tonight. I guess if you have any questions, you could always email Moving and Kita?
Yes. Yes.
Can
Please email us with your
they? Okay. Thanks everyone.
Thank you, everyone.